For 3 hours, a billionaire's baby screamed nonstop at 35,000 feet. First class grew tense. Eyes rolled. Whispers turned sharp. And when a poor black teenager stood up from economy and walked forward, the mood shifted instantly, from irritation to suspicion. Some passengers clutched their armrests. One man muttered that this wasn't his place. No one asked who he was. No one asked why he came. They judged him before he spoke. But seconds later, the entire plane fell silent. What this boy did next didn't just stop the crying. It exposed a truth about race, power, and who America trusts, even in the air. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Before anyone judged him, before whispers filled the cabin, Booker Simon was just a 16-year-old trying to stay invisible. He sat in an economy seat near the back of the plane, knees slightly pulled in, backpack tucked beneath his feet. The straps were worn, patched more than once, but everything inside mattered: math notes, a notebook filled with formulas, and a folded letter that represented years of sacrifice. Booker was traveling alone, something he was used to. Life had taught him early how to move quietly through spaces that weren't built for him. At home, in a small apartment on Chicago's South Side, his days followed a careful rhythm. School, studying late into the night, helping his younger siblings while his mother, Lisa Simon, worked exhausting shifts as a nurse's aide. His grandmother, Rosa Simon, had raised him to believe that intelligence meant responsibility, that if you were given a gift, you used it to help, not to impress. Booker carried that lesson everywhere, even onto this plane. Up front, the world looked very different. Richard Whittaker sat in first class, sharply dressed, exhaustion carved into his face. Power and wealth had shaped most of his life, but none of it prepared him for traveling alone with a 6-month-old baby. Emma's cries had started small, then grew relentless, echoing through the cabin like an alarm no one could shut off. Every solution failed. Every minute stretched thinner. Tension spread fast. A man across the aisle shook his head, irritation written plainly on his face. Harold Morrison, polished and entitled, muttered complaints without lowering his voice. Others followed his lead, their looks saying more than their words ever did. The crying wasn't just noise anymore. It was a problem everyone wanted gone. Booker noticed it all from the back. He heard the tone of the baby's cry and recognized something familiar, something urgent. His body leaned forward before his mind caught up. He knew that sound. He'd lived with it. He'd learned how to respond to it. Still, he hesitated. He was a black teenager walking toward first class. He knew how that story usually ended. As the plane cut through the clouds, two worlds sat separated by a thin curtain, and neither yet realized how close they were to colliding. The crying had become unbearable. Emma's screams cut through the plane in sharp, uneven waves, each one tightening the mood inside first class. Conversations stopped. Screens went dark. Shoulders stiffened. What began as discomfort slowly curdled into resentment, and that resentment needed a target. Booker felt it before anyone said a word. He recognized the sound immediately, not just noise but distress, the kind that came from pain and overstimulation. His hands curled against his knees as memory rushed in. Long nights, a baby who couldn't stop crying, trial and error, learning through exhaustion. He didn't look toward first class at first. He already knew what he would see. When he finally did, the tension hit him all at once. Richard Whittaker stood in the aisle, his daughter pressed against his shoulder, eyes hollow with fatigue. He rocked gently, then faster, then stopped altogether when nothing changed. Flight attendants hovered nearby, offering rehearsed suggestions that clearly weren't working. Bottles, walking, white noise, every idea failed. And then came the looks. Harold Morrison leaned back in his seat, lips pursed, checking his watch loudly. His annoyance was no longer subtle. "This is exactly why children don't belong up here," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. A few passengers nodded. Others looked away, pretending neutrality while sharing the same irritation. Booker noticed something else. The way eyes drifted toward the back of the plane, toward him. He hadn't moved, he hadn't spoken, but he felt it, the familiar weight of suspicion settling in before any action had been taken. He knew this pattern, knew how quickly concern turned into blame when someone like him stepped out of place. Still, the crying didn't stop. Booker shifted forward, heart pounding. He stood slowly, aware of how every movement could be misread. The aisle felt longer than it should have. A flight attendant raised a hand instinctively, her polite smile tightening. "Can I help you?" she asked, already prepared to redirect him. He swallowed. "I think I can help the baby." The words hung in the air. Harold scoffed immediately. "Absolutely not," he said, shaking his head. "This is first class. We don't need random people interfering." A few murmurs followed. Not loud enough to defend him, loud enough to dismiss him. Booker froze. This was the moment he had feared, the one where intention didn't matter, where being young, black, and poor turned help into threat. His instincts screamed to sit back down, to disappear, to protect himself. But then Emma cried again, harder this time. Richard looked up, really looked. Not at the class of the cabin, not at appearances, but at the desperation written across Booker's face. There was no confidence there, no entitlement, just urgency. "What do you think you can do?" Richard asked, voice strained. Booker took a breath. "I've helped babies like this before. The crying sounds like pressure. Sometimes bouncing makes it worse." Silence followed. Harold shook his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're trusting a kid from economy with your child." That word "kid" hit hard. Booker felt heat rise in his chest, but he stayed still. He didn't argue, he didn't defend himself. He just waited. Richard hesitated, then nodded once. "Try." The moment Booker reached out, the tension spiked. Several passengers leaned forward. Others stiffened. Some looked ready to intervene if something went wrong. The judgment was immediate and unforgiving, built not on logic but fear dressed up as concern. Booker adjusted his grip carefully, applying steady pressure, changing the angle just enough to relieve discomfort. He moved with quiet precision, humming softly, not for the baby alone but to steady himself. Emma's cries slowed. A second passed, then another. The screaming dropped to soft hiccups and then stopped completely. The silence was shocking. You could hear breathing. You could hear fabric shift. You could hear the weight of everyone realizing what they had just assumed and how wrong they had been. Harold stared, his mouth slightly open. No one spoke. And Booker stood there, holding the proof that their judgments had never been about safety at all. The silence didn't feel peaceful at first. It felt heavy, like the entire plane was holding its breath, unsure of what it had just witnessed. Emma slept quietly in Booker's arms, her face relaxed, her tiny fingers no longer clenched in distress. The crying that had dominated the flight for hours was gone, replaced by something far more uncomfortable for the adults watching: realization. Booker didn't smile. He didn't look around for approval. He focused only on keeping his hands steady, careful not to wake her. But he could feel it, the shift. The same people who had judged him moments earlier were now staring, not with suspicion, but with disbelief. Richard Whittaker felt it too. Standing beside Booker, he saw the contrast clearly now. The fear that had flashed across faces when a black teenager approached his seat. The way concern for the baby had instantly transformed into concern about who was helping. He had almost listened to it, almost. Harold Morrison broke the silence with an uneasy laugh. "Well, I guess we were wrong," he said, trying to soften his tone. But the words landed hollow, too late, too convenient. Booker gently handed Emma back, careful and composed. "She should stay calm now," he said quietly. That was it. No lecture, no victory speech, just truth delivered without accusation. But the damage had already been done. Phones were raised. Passengers whispered, not about the baby anymore, but about themselves, about what they had assumed, about how quickly fear had replaced empathy. No one apologized out loud. They didn't have to. Their silence said enough. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He looked at Booker and saw more than skill. He saw restraint. The kind forged by years of knowing that one wrong move could erase any good intention. "You didn't hesitate," Richard said. "Even after everything." Booker met his eyes briefly. "I did," he replied. "I just didn't let it stop me." That sentence lingered. Harold looked away, suddenly very interested in the window. The authority he had carried moments earlier had vanished. For the first time on the flight, he was the one shrinking. But the climax wasn't the silence. It wasn't the baby sleeping. It was what followed. A flight attendant leaned in, her voice low. "We're almost ready to descend," she said, then paused. "Thank you for helping." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. But it was the first crack in the wall. As the plane began its descent, Booker returned to his seat in economy. The curtain slid shut again, separating the cabin. But it couldn't undo what had happened. The line between privilege and prejudice had been exposed, right there in the air. Richard remained standing for a moment, holding his sleeping daughter, staring at the closed divider. He realized something then. This wasn't just a story about a crying baby or a helpful teenager. It was about how easily fear speaks louder than facts, about how quickly race rewrites intention, and about how close he had come to letting that happen. As the wheels touched the runway, one truth settled heavily over the cabin. What happened on this flight wouldn't end when the doors opened. It was only beginning. When the flight finally ended, there was no applause, no grand acknowledgement, just quiet movement and lowered eyes. Passengers gathered their belongings, careful not to meet Booker Simon's gaze as they passed through the aisle. The moment had already happened. The truth had already been revealed. Booker stepped off the plane carrying the same backpack he boarded with, but the weight felt different now. Not lighter, heavier. What stayed with him wasn't pride. It was the familiar realization that doing the right thing as a black teenager often came with a silent cost. He had helped. He had proven himself. And still, the suspicion had come first. Richard Whittaker walked behind him, holding Emma close. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that her cries had exposed something far louder than noise. For Richard, the flight rewired something fundamental. He replayed the hesitation, the looks, the way reason had nearly been overridden by fear shaped by race. Power hadn't protected him from making the wrong assumption. It had almost enabled it. Later that night, as Booker returned to his life in Chicago, reality waited for him exactly as it always had. His mother, Lisa Simon, listened quietly as he explained the trip, pride and worry mixing in her expression. His grandmother, Rosa Simon, reminded him gently that integrity often goes unseen, but never unnoticed. Booker nodded, knowing that moments like the one on the plane weren't rare exceptions. They were patterns. The incident didn't go viral. There were no headlines. And that in itself was the point. Every day, black people navigate spaces where their intentions are questioned before their actions are understood, where help is mistaken for threat, where silence from bystanders speaks just as loudly as open hostility. The flight wasn't unique, it was a mirror. Booker went on with his life, carrying both his brilliance and the burden of being constantly judged. But something had shifted, not in the world, but in awareness. One moment had forced a cabin full of people to confront the truth they usually ignore. Racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind concern. Sometimes it shows up at 35,000 feet and waits to see who we trust. The question is simple and uncomfortable. If you had been on that plane, who would you have believed? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.